Thank you to the Biolinks Alliance. They represent what I believe is the future of conservation, and that future is on connectivity conservation, and I'll talk about that today. My accent is from the US. I'm from Montana. That's one of the Rocky Mountain states, and I've been very involved in connectivity conservation for about 30 years. So tonight's presentation is all about connectivity. And I'm not talking about connectivity of your cell phones. I'm talking about connectivity as it relates to how you can connect nature, how you can connect organizations, how you can connect communities so that smaller parts are bigger as a broader network. And that's kind of what Biolinks Alliance is trying to do, and there are a lot of organizations like Biolinks Alliance around the world that are what we call connector organizations. And I work at one in Montana called the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. So tonight's presentation is I'm going to go through a vignette of stories of various connective projects that kind of shape where I have come from to at least share with you how I evolved both personally and professionally within this field of connectivity conservation. First slide. Next. So I am a serial animal toucher. I'm a wildlife veterinarian. I was the first field veterinarian for the Bronx Zoo, the New York Zoological Society, that zoo in New York that's in a remote borough, and they sent me all around the world touching animals. And what I realized in my work as a wildlife veterinarian is that I was treating or dealing with the same health issues over and over again. Well, the best thing I could do for animal health was to protect their habitat. And so that was my first evolution. Next slide. So when I was, one of my first jobs, and I was in my early 20s, is I had to go to Uganda, and that country, and I call that country the, where hope is the currency of conservation, where hope was decimated. If you thought of a kind of a Armageddon view of conservation where things had completely collapsed, where the parks had collapsed, where most all of the mega charismatic wildlife had been shot, killed, or poached, you would not think that nature would ever rebound. And this is where I arrived in this country, which was once called the Pearl of Africa by Churchill in the 1980s, where I found a complete legacy of decimation. Next slide. And I was placed in Kibale Forest, which is this forest in western Uganda. It's a montane forest. It's well known for its primates. It has the highest density and diversity of primates, non-human primates, in East Africa. Next slide. And if you can see, I'm sorry the lighting, but if you can see that the forest is this completely island. It's like if you look at a map of the Grampians flying over Victoria, it's like an island. You could be flying over the Grampians here. So it's this island of forest that's surrounded by humanity in western Uganda. Next slide. So I was sent out there as a wildlife vet, and I was looking at the relationship of the forest ecology and diseases. And I was on my way, a very academic training, and I was very much had no idea what conservation was. Next slide. And in this forest, there were all these different primates, and so my mind was expanded that beyond humans, there are non-human primates. And there were 13 different species in this one forest, and it has the highest density of chimpanzees in the world. So I know that many of you may know of Jane Goodall, who did a lot of work in Tanzania, but if you really wanted to see chimpanzees, you would go to Kibale Forest. Next slide. So there were also human primates in Kibale at that time. There were the folks who lived in the area who had a poor standard of living, who were subsistence, and we grow up with them calling them poachers, and then I had to run a group of game guards to keep the poachers out of this forest, as well as do work on my research at the same time. And I will say that creates a conflict with communities that is, I would say, very militaristic, and that was like either someone was bad or someone was good, and there wasn't really a different way of working with communities. So we're essentially fragmenting communities in the way we were dealing with local communities at that time. Next slide. Now, while I was there, the tension that can arise from this conflict with people led to a suspicion of why would expatriates from North America or from around the world go to this forest and study primates. They must be doing something subversive. For local folks, this was kind of a foreign concept of someone coming in doing wildlife research. And so that kind of local animosity built up to a point where they lobbied the government to expel all the wildlife researchers from this forest and give it over to a Malaysian concession to cut it down, complete cut down. Well, I mean, if you think about it, they weren't getting any kind of benefits from these wildlife scientists. The forest had timber value. They could have all the food they wanted without getting caught for poaching. So it was a big incentive to cut the forest down. And so the head of the New York Zoological Society, Bronx Zoo, said, well, you're there, we don't have anyone else, could you help correct this problem? And I've said, well, what about my research? And he said, well, it's either you or no one else. And I'm 20 some years old at this point, and I've never done this. I don't have the skill set. And here we're dealing with a multinational company, from Malaysia that's, doing the same thing they've done to palm oil in Borneo. Next slide. So over the next couple years, I went out and started talking to people, and this is the human connectivity of the story. I talked to the locals, I talked to the government, I went to the presidents, I went to the donors. I just started talking about what the value of this forest was, and that there were alternative means of looking at this forest versus just cut wood. Next slide. And in that talking, people built some trust. They maybe had a different frame of solutions, and they said, well, let's see if this can be part of the package to rebuild Uganda's national parks. And through some convincing, some donor investment, some risk-taking, we helped transform this park that was going to be a concession and had support from international donors to help buy out that concession and make this a national park. Now, Kibale Forest is now a national park, and it's one of the premier ecotourism sites in that country, and it brings in millions of dollars a year. And those poachers that you saw are now running little eco-cafes, or they're naturalists, and they're sending their kids to school, and there's all these side economies that have built off of tourism, that now that park has a real value for that community. And that kind of threat that we had before with a militaristic response has now changed. Next slide. So this is, I'm in this one park, Kibale Forest, you see in the top right, all the way up there. But then I realized I'm in a whole other landscape of other parks and other people, and this is just one example. So I'm looking at how is this landscape connected to, or how is this park connected to other parks in the region. Next slide. So I guess my success bred to other kind of problems. I was thrown into Windy Impenetrable National Park, where they were trying to deal with mountain gorillas at that time, and they were thinking, how can we develop a similar kind of process we had in Kibale with having mountain gorillas being an ecotourism kind of economic engine for that region. Next slide. So again, this is a serial animal toucher that I am. I did not provoke this touching. This was actually come from the other way around. If you've ever been to this part of the world and working with a lot of the mountain gorillas there, they're completely habituated because people like me spent many, many weeks living and cowering in fear that we would not be eaten alive by unhabituated male silverback gorillas. Next slide. Which can be extremely aggressive. And there are other stories that we can talk about at another time about how I definitely did cower for my life. All I can tell you is that one scene is that if you can imagine a high grass mountain area and you hear this screech from another mountain nearby, and you don't see anything but the fold of grass coming toward you. And the next thing you know is you have this hot sauna of air at the back of your neck. Because you're not going to look up and turn around and have an aggressive response to this animal. That's how these animals are habituated over time, because I didn't fight back. Anyway, if I did, I wouldn't live to tell you about it. Next slide. So, I mean, this is one of the most iconic, we're talking about, and now I'm talking about connectivity again. This is connectivity in terms of kinship with other species. Because when you look into the eyes of these great apes, you can see, that we are very similar, how much emotion we share, and how sentient they are. Next slide. And at that time, I helped create something called the International Gorilla Conservation Program. See, at that point in history, Uganda and Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo all had mountain gorillas, and there's only, at that time, there were about 600 of them left in the world, that's it. And they were all managing these gorillas separately and not together, as if they could control this resource and help manage this in separate ways. It's because these gorillas were on a mountain range that crossed all 3 different countries. And so I helped connect people to look at how do we work with these gorillas as a connected community. Next slide. And of course, this has now become another tourism mecca, and it's become so lucrative that Rwanda now charges, I believe, $1,500 per person per 1 hour visit with the gorillas. And when I started, it was $50. So that's inflation. There's a lot of money being made off of gorillas right now in this part of the world. And if you've been to Rwanda, and again, where hope has changed, where they had that holocaust of history there, you will see now that Rwanda is one of the most changed, transformed countries in Africa. It's a story of hope. Now you may complain about the leader of the country is a bit dictatorial, but maybe out of Plato's Republic, he was a benign dictator in that regard. Next slide. And a typical viewing is, you can see this park has a hard edge to it, and you would start at some point, you know, for your gorilla permit, and then you'd walk, and this is my transect to see a habituated gorilla group in Rwanda. And it doesn't take very far, and it's complete transition of habitat, and you go from about 8,000, I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in feet. You're going to have 8,000 feet to about 11,000 feet in elevation gain. Next slide. And this is your typical kind of interaction. You have to keep a certain amount of meters away, and I took this because everyone in this picture is breaking those guidance for how close tourists can get with the gorillas. Again, they're so habituated, they'll come near you, come toward you. It's quite an amazing connection with wildlife. I believe it's one of the most spectacular wildlife connections you can have. Next slide. Of course, when you get so close, you have to take certain precautions, and these are game guards who've taken precautions with regards to not transmitting human diseases, because it's human respiratory diseases that causes health problems in these great apes. Next slide. And this is where I knew things had changed in this part of the world, and this is in Uganda, where instead of poaching, you had the game guards taking photos as if they're ecotourists too of the wildlife. So they're getting into wildlife viewing, and the kind of that values that we thought of us versus them have become all of us. Next slide. So I got involved in that disparate part of great apes, of gorillas, and there are 4 different subspecies of gorillas, 2 species, eastern and western gorilla, and I was involved in the mountain gorillas in the east around Bwindi and the Virunga Park. And then I was asked to go to Nigeria, where the rarest great ape in the world is. 250 individuals of cross-river gorilla exist on the border between Cameroon and Nigeria. Next slide. And they're extremely rare, and the only way I ever got to see one was through a camera trap like this that I worked with at helping WCS, or Wildlife Conservation Society, which used to be called the New York Zoological Society, which used to be called the Bronx Zoo. Next slide. And the problem here, and this is where, you know, I'm going to draw this all back and get to Yellowstone, to Yukon. So I'm just giving you kind of my journey here, is that one of the reasons there's only 250 of these individual great apes left is because they're in 11 or 12 different habitat fragments. And that's not going to solve anyone's long-term conservation. If you know, animals that are put into small fragmented populations eventually go extinct. So the key for their survival is connectivity. Is how do we connect those habitat fragments up, and that where matings and reproduction can happen between these various isolates. Next slide. So that's what I did. I helped with the WCS, or New York Zoological Society, build connectivity corridors between these areas, work with the local communities again, trying to take disparate communities and build a bigger network so that these species can survive. Next slide. And of course, in those areas, This is where people, unlike East Africa, people actually eat primates here. So this is a very tough area to work on because primate is part of the diet of the local human population there, and which is why we have such issues of Ebola outbreaks in that part of the world. But it's still, it's something, again, it's how people look at wildlife. Is it something to eat? Is it something to value more than just a food product? Next slide. And you know, so this is just the fun we have because we never get to see the gorillas because there's so few of them, but we go and see their scat or their feces, and then we lay in their nests to see what their bed was like that night. Next slide. And I still go over. It's 25 years, and I started this when I was 22 years of age, and I still work on great apes. I go back and forth. But the question I was asked when I was doing all this work is, Gary, it's great that you're here. Thank you for helping us. But what have you done in your own country? and that really got me. You know, it's like, okay, you know, okay, I see the point here. So that's when I went back to the U.S. Next slide. And this is what I found when I came back to North America. And so with the same lens that I had working in East Africa, I could see, oh my God, I'm working in a fragmented continent just like I was working in Africa. And in fact, this is the map of essentially the astounding growth of our cities in North America. I mean, we're getting what we call megacities, where you don't drive out of a city anymore. You just drive from one suburb that leads to another city, which then leads to a suburb, leads to another city. We're complete wholesale transformation of our landscape, much of it in the east and in the central part of the country, which is why the Rocky Mountains are so valuable, because it's one of the places where nature is left. Next slide. So, over the history of the 17 largest mammal species in North America, from the bison to the grizzly bear, there's been this migration, or let's say decrease or loss of habitat for all these species to where they're mainly found right now, where all 17 are found in the Rocky Mountains of the West. Next slide. This is just the distribution, or the retreating distribution, of grizzly bears in North America. And as you can see, they extended all the way to Mexico, and then over time went into these little islands, just like I showed you with the Cross River gorilla, and then winked out because there was no connectivity. And then they're only found now in the very darkest red, which is that circle, which is Yellowstone. They're a complete island in Yellowstone. And then that arm there in Glacier National Park in Montana, all the way up to Alaska. But there's been a whole retreat of grizzly bears, and I think it's kind of absurd that California considers it the land of the golden bear. That's the grizzly bear. And if you look on California State Park's emblem, their state park's emblem is a bear. That's extinct in their state. So it's kind of perverse that that would be the iconic image of their state parks, but everything in California is about the golden bear. Even the universities, the Bruins, the UCLA Bruins, the University of California golden bears, but it's perverse, even on the flag. That's the last grizzly bear in California. It's stuffed. It's kind of like Far Lap. That's the Far Lap of California. It's from 1922. When did Far Lap get poisoned by us? Next slide. So, okay, so in this kind of global process of fragmentation, you asked policymakers and you asked scientists, well, if fragmentation is a big problem for conserving biodiversity on this planet, how much do we need? And policymakers will always give you these low figures because they're always thinking about feasibility, and the scientists will give you the real figures of what you need, and policymakers always seem, well, it's about between 3% of the landscape, or 12%, and then scientists will universally say around 50%. This is how much of land and water we need around the world to save the world's biodiversity. But we're nowhere near that level of conservation. Next slide. Can we click on this? So I was at a meeting with E.O. Wilson. This is Ed Wilson. He's a famous Harvard conservation biologist. And I asked him, well, how much of the world should we save, Ed? And, it was the fish story. It's this big. And that's him. That's the man who wrote the theory of island biogeography, one of the key scientific underpinnings of why larger scale conservation is important for saving species. Next slide. So the issue is that with this fragmentation, with climate change, with all these impacts that people, our growing population on the planet, are having, this is what is the ultimate health issue as someone who spans between health and ecology, is that we're having a state shift of the ecology of the planet. You knock out species, you knock out interactions, you knock out how the globe works, you are going to see this kind of cascade of impacts happen around the world. And this is, some people call it planetary thresholds, but this is what keeps me up at night, is that we are not taking care of the health of the planet. This is not about just our backyard, but this is how all our backyards add up to each other so that we have a healthy planet. Next slide. So more than 50%, I said, well, scientists say we need 50% of the world for conserving it to conserve the world's biodiversity. But as you can see in the red, more than 50% of the planet is now dominated by people. And I guess the Sahara, the Outback, the Amazon's intact, more or less. It's, you know, there are rare places in the world where you have large intact natural areas. Next slide. And in fact, we only have 23% of the world's wilderness left. And the last two slides were generated by a scientist out of University of Queensland named James Watson. James Watson, that's right. Next slide. So here's this competing, now these two like competing memes now in terms of, well, what should we do for saving nature? How much nature should we conserve? One is Ed Wilson, the one I just showed you, his book called Half Earth, and the other one is Nature Needs Half, and National Geographic is trying to come up with a campaign called 50% by 2050. Now, what I find funny is that the Half Earth people and the Nature Needs Half people don't like each other. And they don't even talk to each other because it's kind of like an ego thing, like who saved the Earth? And, you know, and for me, I don't know if I could just live with half the Earth. Can't they just put it together and have a whole Earth and one side can take, next slide. But, you know, the problem with saving, you know, biodiversity is that we've had bad press. And this is, if you look on this graph here, all the brown is the number of articles in the media that have been about climate change since, you know, going from 1990. But that little green one is just all the articles about biodiversity loss. And you can see we've really had a bad PR campaign about all the loss of nature and what it means to the health of this planet. Next slide. So there's this whole movement going on globally about we have to enhance the scale of conservation. We have to move up in scale because the way we're doing it now in a piecemeal fashion isn't big enough. Next slide. Why is this? Well, here's our maybe it might have been America's, they say it's America's greatest idea, it may be our last greatest idea. It's that this is Yellowstone National Park. I live outside of Yellowstone. It's about an hour away from where I live. It was the first national park in 1872. Sorry, people who believe it's Royal National Park. But you know, it is. But what you see up there as the first national park is what? A box. I mean, this is how we thought about conserving nature, as a box. I mean, this is, and we're really going to solve a round planet with a box. So if you think like a box, next slide, this is how you manage nature. Now, does this make sense? This is the border of Yellowstone National Park, and you can see the trees are growing in the national park, and there are no trees in the national forest. I'm sorry. Every time I look at this slide, I just have to laugh. I mean, you know, it just epitomizes our kind of approach to saving land and nature. I mean, we really put ourselves in boxes, if you will, and it doesn't work whether it's public lands, and it really doesn't work whether it's private lands. We're really kind of bizarre creatures as we look at a system that's really a holistic system. Next slide. So a few years ago, you know, they've been putting collars on the big wildlife in Yellowstone, and these are all the different populations of elk, a big ungulate in Yellowstone. Then they put collars on, and they mapped where they've been going. And I tell everyone this is the London Tube map of elk migration in Yellowstone. And you know, as you can see, the wildlife don't even stay put in the box. So, I mean, and the box was there to protect the wildlife. So it's absurd, right? Next slide. So this idea in the 60s, 70s came, well, we'll protect the ecosystem. We'll just make the box a little bit bigger. We'll make it rounder, and we'll make it a polygon instead of a box, and maybe that will, conserve nature. And, and we're finding that's not big enough as well. Next slide. So, for instance, this just came out about a month ago, and this was a global assessment of all the major wildlife movement around the world, and every continent around the world, except Antarctica, where they don't have this kind of ecology. Wildlife are moving by 50% that they once were. And why do you think that is? It's because of fragmentation. We're just enclosing. We're closing and closing and closing and closing on how animals move in nature. Next slide. We're losing the great migrations of the world. National Geographic did a whole series about this, just to point out, one of the amazing phenomenon of nature we're just losing, just the way how we're treating the landscape and seascapes of the planet. Next slide. So here is my tenet to you in terms of maybe you can help me in terms of thinking about the future of conservation. In 19th century, we had the national park concept, and that's really a 19th century concept, and it was a box. And then we tried to expand the box in the 20th century, and we created an ecosystem concept. But I'm going to tell you that it's all connected now, and in the 21st century, we're about process conservation. And what do I mean by that? Well, now, next slide. Now we have to protect the wildlife migrations, we have to protect pollination, we have to protect the hydrology, we have to protect the fire ecology. We now have to protect the processes that sustain nature itself. We're working, the way we work cumulatively on this planet, we have an impact over all these scales that we're affecting how even the cycling of water impacts on this planet. Next slide. So connectivity in a kind of basic framework. Isolation is bad, you connect it, it's better, and you can look at this in whether landscapes or seascapes or atmospherically even. In fact, if 70%, if we lose more than 30% of the Amazon, there will be a flip in the ecology of the Amazon that it will no longer produce the rain that sustains the Amazon. So, this is what I mean by we have to protect the hydrology of the planet, because what happens in the Amazon has global consequences for the climate in other parts of the world. And so, well, can we protect 50% of the Amazon? We can't. We have to protect all of the Amazon because we need that hydrologic engine that it has of drawing water out of that system and then putting it back into the atmosphere. Next slide. So corridors, or this connective issue, was once a theory. And it's been a theory for 60 years. And then over time, the science community has shown that it is empirical. You can be tested, you can demonstrate it, that it's important for saving nature. If you're going to have a fragmented landscape, well, the most effective thing you can do is to connect it. Next slide. So if we're going to go to large-scale conservation, and most of the world is human-dominated, and how are we going to go there? Can we start creating big landscapes out of nothing? No, you have to figure out some kind of connected landscape, and you create what is called conservation networks. So what you're doing here with Biolinks Alliance, you're creating a conservation network. You're trying to essentially take the pieces that you have and get more and effective nature conservation out of the pieces that you have. Next slide. Because if you look at nature as an organism, the heart, lungs, and organs of nature are the protected areas, the parks. But the circulatory system, we haven't done a really good job of conserving the circulatory system, which is why connectivity conservation is important. Next slide. Which gets into, well, what's in that area outside of protected areas, outside of marine parks? Well, this is what they call, it's not a movie, actually scientists call it the matrix. And it is this mixed land use, and it's everyone's different boxes on top, different boxes in different kind of jurisdictions. And, from an ecological sense, it's kind of all over the map. And can we make sense of it, both for people who own the land, but also for conserving nature? Next slide. So we're moving from what I would call, they used to call it eco-regional kind of portfolio of landscape management to whole systems management. Every conservation, there's conservation value in all lands. There's conservation value in all waters. Nothing is sacrificial when you look at time, because things can heal over time. And I showed you in Uganda, people gave up Uganda for dead, and that country came back in 2 decades. Next slide. And when the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which has the biggest ag producers in the world as part of its 200 multinational members, say that landscape connectivity is important to their business models, that they cannot exist to do the big agriculture. Big agriculture is saying we need landscape connectivity as a call to action. Then you know we're like, you know, this is the group that usually fights this kind of conversation, not the ones who try to champion it. Next slide. Because they know they're spending billions of dollars on pollination, they're spending more billions of dollars on water, and at the same time their soils are being degraded, and they, you know, this is the livelihood of their agricultural models. So besides, you know, agriculture, the other big issue that causes fragmentation are roads. So if you, next slide, if you take every paved road that you know of now, and in the next 30 years, double it, that's how fast road building is going on around the world. A lot of it financed by the Chinese. And that road building is happening in high biodiversity places, like the Amazon, because they're trying to get access to markets in remote places. Next slide. So these are the last roadless areas of the world. And a lot of those roadless areas, especially in the tropical areas, parts of the world, are going to be targeted for fragmentation by this linear infrastructure disease that's going on right now. Next slide. So I live in Montana. This is my state. And everyone thinks this is a rural state. But if you look at the true road infrastructure in Montana, this is what it really looks like. So if this is happening in my little state, and you can understand that this affects everything about how we use the landscape and deal with biodiversity, and is a huge fragmenting force, you can imagine what this is going to be like in high biodiversity areas around the world. Next slide. And because with roads are not just the impact itself, they have a disturbance zone that runs between 1 kilometer to 5 kilometers on each side of each road. And that has a huge impact. It's called the edge effect. So every road you punch in has a disproportionately impact on the land or the land that it surrounds. Next slide. And of course, you know, it's like the chicken can cross the road. Well, wildlife are finding it very, very difficult to cross the road. They become the Berlin Walls of biodiversity. They become, why are wildlife, why are these big mammals not moving as much? It's because roads are part of that fragmenting leading of the edge that stops animal movement. Next slide. So all of us have seen these signs here. These signs don't work. So when you're driving around, you know what these signs tell you? These signs tell you what wildlife you're going to hit. This has nothing to do, they do not prevent you from slowing down, or, you know, the research shows they're ineffective. But at least it'll tell you what you hit. Next slide. And there's a road right now in one of the most, being planned in one of the most pristine national parks in the world. That's the Serengeti, which has one of the most amazing great migrations, the 1.8 million animal wildebeest that travel around that ecosystem. Next slide. And it's not only roads. If anyone's ever been to India, rail in India is going crazy. Rail in my part of the world, in Montana, is going crazy. With the coal boom that's happening in China, with China building so many coal plants per month, I forget what the number is, it was astounding. We went from 8 rail trains a day to 40 rail trains a day. And they want our coal more than your coal because our coal has low sulfur. And they can't dig it up fast enough, this low sulfur coal. Next slide. Of course, you know, how we deal with fences. Fencing, this is why we work with a lot of landowners. All we had to do was change the bottom fence wire from a barbed wire to a slim wire, and wildlife that could once not move can now move in this landscape. But fencing's a big barrier. And when you talk about fencing, next slide, we have our government. This is America's worst idea. I told you about America's greatest idea. This is the worst idea. This is the wall between Mexico and Canada that's being built. And as you can see, it makes no sense for people who can use ladders, and certainly no sense for wildlife. Next slide. So, all right, I've given you this kind of portrait of what's going on around the world. Now I'm going to drill you down into kind of some of the areas that we're trying to find some solutions. Now, this is Glacier National Park, also near where I work. And Glacier National Park is famous because in the next 30 years, everything happens in 30 years, I don't know why, but in the next 30 years, we're going to lose all its glaciers. So a park that was created for its glaciers are going to be no glaciers, and that's true. We've lost, they had 150 glaciers at the turn of the last century, in 1900. There's now about 25 glaciers left, and they think all 25 will be gone in the next 30 years. This is the retreat of one of those glaciers in Glacier National Park. Next slide. So how will species respond to a climate-changing world? Next slide. So in Glacier Park, we have a species X here. Next button, can you just hit it again? With a lot of species, they're trying to track the changes in the environment. They're generally moving poleward, which here is going south, us going north. And next slide. And we happen to have a US border in the way. And we're having the things that we protected the park for move to Canada. And I think they're just telling us that they're going to get to Canada before the Americans. And next slide. And this is where Glacier National Park is right on the border. So you can see that, we're seeing that, if we don't want to pay attention and if we want to deny what's going on, at least the wildlife and nature is telling us what's going on. They don't have their heads in the sand. Next slide. So part of this in Australia is that Australia's really, as you guys have topped 50 degrees Celsius, you're kind of the leaders, and everyone looks to Australia and say, well, my God, the impacts of climate change are one of the biggest here. And in fact, one of the drivers of climate change is what they call climate velocity. And you have some of the fastest driving rates of climate change outside of the poles. And this is just a map of climate velocity that's happening primarily in the dark blue areas. Where you see the long arrows, that means it's going faster. Those are the HOV, or the high-speed lanes for climate change in your country. Next slide. So when people look at, well, what can we do in this climate-changing world? Well, voila, they ask all the managers, and the best thing we can do is promote connectivity conservation. So here it is again, that word connectivity. So we can do something. Connectivity is not just important for maintaining species, but it's also maintaining the resilience of landscapes to a changing climate, because things need to move and they need space to move and they need that kind of buffer to move, and connectivity does that. Next slide. And one of the tragically great ideas to deal with connectivity was building road crossings. And here is in Banff National Park, where they built a 50-meter wide road crossing because they built this double-lane highway in the middle of in Canada's first national park, where it completely had a fragmentation impact on the wildlife there. Bears, wildlife could not cross. And so they built this overcross. They didn't know whether they would work. Next slide. Well, they worked really well. In fact, it took animals several years to learn, but then they learned really well. It went from like 100 crossings in the first year to 600,000 crossings of different species in 7 years. I know, it's amazing. And they had to do these genetic studies with these barbed wires where an animal would lose a bit of its hair when it came by, and you could get the DNA. So they knew it wasn't the same bear going 600,000 times. Next slide. Of course, no one ever anticipated that bears would come at different directions across it, and then they have these aggressive kind of encounters. Next slide. But they've worked by and large. So small efforts can, this is just how one small bit of connectivity can have an immense continental impact on conservation. So if you can do it at 50 meters, maybe we could be a bit more ambitious in other ways. Next slide. And of course, these kind of crossings have gone on around the world. Christmas Island and the crabs is one of the more famous ones. There are now crossings for elephants in East Africa. It's an easy mechanical fix. It's not the perfect thing. That's why I call them tragically effective. Next slide. But what about connectivity within agriculture? Well, we know that there are different bundles of ecosystem services we get from different types of land uses, and natural ecosystems can give you a whole range of bundles. That's what these little star graphs are. And then if you have intensive cropland, you certainly get high yield intensive crops. But is there something that's in between for both agriculture and biodiversity? Next slide. So there's this whole concept brewing up now, and it's kind of controversial, is whether to have land sharing, where you share where you do organic farming over a larger scale, where you try to mix essentially agriculture with biodiversity? Or do you set aside some of the land specifically for biodiversity or some of the land specifically for high yield agriculture? And that debate is going on right now. So I just want to tell you where that debate is on this. But it does show that the yield, if you have organic low yield, you can actually have a bigger impact on biodiversity loss than if you had separation with higher yield with more intact native areas. And I can answer that in any kind of questions. Next slide. So connectivity can be restored. This is Mata Atlantica, a forest in Brazil, where they restored connectivity within an agricultural area. And they've brought back much of the key biodiversity aspects of that part of Brazil. Next slide. And then Yellowstone to Yukon. This is kind of the leading the end. So over time, I was very much involved in, so I came back from Africa, I worked in all these parks, and I entered in Yellowstone to Yukon where we had all these mammals left. And I worked to build, they were becoming fragmented, this part of the world, where we had 700 protected areas, all becoming more and more fragmented. So that whole kind of loss of mammals was now coming to the Rocky Mountains. And how were we going to prevent that effect from occurring? So this is why this Yellowstone to Yukon effort came about. Next slide. As you can see, on the left side, I worked in the Albertine Rift. It's a complete parallel to what happened in North America. We had parks in a fragmented world, so it was very easy for me to see how the parallels between these two efforts could come. And so essentially, Africa was not an exception. Africa was more the rule of how large-scale fragmentation can happen. And Yellowstone to Yukon was born out of how do we essentially do what we were trying to do in Africa as well. Next slide. And as you can see, both have hard edge effects on their parks. This is agriculture around Bwindi Park in Uganda. This is Yellowstone National Park. Next slide. And they both had different kinds of signage for animals goring tourists. You can be gored by a tourist, by a bison in Yellowstone, or you can be gored by an elephant in Bwindi Park. Next slide. But basically, what this, I'm getting to is that in having this, we had 300 groups come together, all of them working on the same issue, all of them connected to this landscape but not connected to each other, all of them not realizing that if they could work together and combine resources, they could get much more done and attract attention to this part of the world. And from the day we started to, in the 20-year period that I show here, we have protected both on private lands and public lands over 24 million acres of land. Now that's 12 times, thank you, that's 12 times Yellowstone National Park. So, our evolution, and that includes working with a lot of private landowners to protect conservation easements to support wildlife conservation on private lands. Next slide. And this has caught fire. So our federal government got involved and wanted to repeat this with its large landscape cooperative. So they're trying to spread this kind of thinking in other parts of the US. Next slide. And we realized that the Yellowstone to Yukon idea had kind of a catalytic effect. It had an infectious feeling that maybe we can do things at a bigger scale than we could before. So there are over 300 large-scale efforts now working in North America. And they're all connected now, just like those particular fragments in Yellowstone to Yukon. They're all connected now through the Network for Landscape Conservation. If any of you work with Land Trust, you may have heard the Land Trust Alliance. Well, the same group that helped build the Land Trust Alliance in North America have now working to build this Network for Landscape Conservation, bringing all the kind of Biolinks Alliance together to work together. Next slide. Hopefully connecting a once fragmented North America. Next slide. So, and we're not the only ones. We have the GER, and you're embedded in the GER in this part of the world. Yellowstone to Yukon, all of this is catching fire all around the world. Next slide. And in fact, we tried to map where these happen. We have 125 large-scale conservation efforts happening. This is not just something in our backyard. This is something that's happening around the world. And when the marine people heard about these large-scale collaborative efforts, they said, well, we want to be involved too. You know, we're trying to connect marine areas, and we want to be represented. So right now, we have mapped all these areas. You can go to this website to find out who's doing what where. Next slide. And, you know, and you pare down that Australia is one of the leaders in this. And while you think you may be alone, you guys are actually, you know, leading the way. And maybe you see the problems, and maybe you because you're so personal and up close with some of the challenges here, you may not see yourselves as leaders. But in reality, you know, when people see this, how many kind of large-scale efforts are happening in Australia, they're inspired. Next slide. So here you are in the GER and the Great Eastern Ranges, and, you know, Biolinks Alliance is a very critical component of this. And all I can say in just finishing here is that we, you know, this kind of, I'll take questions now, but this kind of approach isn't some kind of top-down process. This is a bottom-up process of groups like you working up to work with neighbors who are sitting in similar rooms in similar areas across this landscape. And so whatever we can do to help promote and support this kind of work, this is the way it's going to happen, because there's going to be no top-down government solution. Resources are very poor. We're dealing with these global threats. Climate change and invasive species are bigger than any one of us can manage. Fire ecology, for sure, in this part of the world. And we can only do this if we work together. And this is the future of conservation. And I'm sorry there's not going to be some big scientist who can come in and give you a solution, but actually you guys are the solution, and thank you for working with scientists. Thank you.